Hello and welcome to Creative Intelligence. I'm your host, Kartik Hosanagar. I'm a professor at the Wharton School, where I study the business and societal implications of AI. We have a fun episode today, which is on AI and consciousness. And it is an episode that I'm excited about and something that I've been thinking about, in fact, motivated by a couple recent conversations. A few months ago, one of my students asked me in the classroom whether I believe we can have conscious AI. I don't believe LLMs have consciousness. I don't believe we are close to it. I don't believe transformer models are getting us there. But if you were to ask me more generally, will we eventually build sentient machines? I honestly don't know. And will we eventually, even if we're not trying to create or build sentient machines, might it accidentally emerge? I honestly don't know. So these are the kinds of themes that I wanted to explore today. And I'm really excited about this episode because it combines high tech with deep philosophical questions about what it means to be a conscious entity and has great sci-fi intrigue with sentient machines and the like. And to guide us through our exploration of the topic, I'm really excited about our guest who is a professor at Sussex. It's Professor Anil Seth. He is a neuroscientist, a TED speaker, and the author of the book Being You, which I highly recommend. He studies the biological basis of consciousness, and he's here to talk to us about brains, about machines, and about where our sense of self comes from. So Anil, thank you so much for joining our show.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Anil, where I want to start our conversation is, in fact, the very basics of consciousness, because it's a topic that's very poorly understood, even though all of us experience it and have an intuitive sense of what it means to be conscious. But I guess from a scientific perspective, I want to ask you, what does it mean for matter to be conscious?
Well, you're right that it's something that's puzzled not only scientists, but basically everybody for thousands of years. How do we think about the relationship between thoughts, between mental experiences, mental content, and physical stuff? And I think the first thing to get across is a minimal definition so that we at least know what we're talking about or what we're not talking about. And consciousness for me is fundamentally very simple. There's a philosopher called Thomas Nagel who I think put it quite well when he said that for a conscious creature, or it could be a conscious system, anything, there is something it is like to be that system. And what he's getting at there is that it feels like something to be a conscious creature. It doesn't feel like anything to be a table or a chair or a car. And I like this definition because it's very inclusive, right? We're not making any assumptions about the need to have an elaborate sense of personal identity or to have language or to be a particular species. Just that there is something going on for that system to be itself. The redness of red, the paininess of pain for a human being. Any kind of experience whatsoever, that's consciousness.
Yeah, that's super helpful. It seems like feelings and experience are a big component of it. Is that a fair way
I
to
would
look
say,
at it?
yeah, I mean, I almost use experience in this context sort of synonymously with consciousness. I mean, experience is a bit broader, we can have life experience and so on. But feelings, emotions, those are part of it, but so is our visual experience, the sights, the sounds of just gazing at a sunset, that's part of consciousness. And of course, our inner stream of thoughts, our inner voice, our sense of self, that's part of consciousness too. Anything that constitutes our moment-to-moment experience, that's part of consciousness. Anything that doesn't, isn't.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess building on that, since consciousness is tied to the sense of being, the sense of that experience and so on, to what extent is consciousness a mirror of reality versus something that we subjectively construct in our brains? And I mean that both in the sense of, perhaps a general question of, what is real versus what are we constructing that is, just all going on in our mind, almost like a simulation going on in our mind.
I mean, it's a beautiful question, I think. It brings up many different things. It brings up the relationship between conscious experience and physical objective reality, which is actually a slightly different question. I think it's just important to get clear on that. So on the one hand, we have the key philosophical and scientific mystery of consciousness, which is basically that we're made of stuff. Stuff is complicated. Physicists don't really understand what matter is, what stuff is, but nonetheless, we're made of stuff, and somehow the stuff that we're made of, and perhaps other things too, is capable of a conscious experience. It's not just dead on the inside. We have life, we have experiences, we have consciousness. So that's the fundamental mystery around which a lot of the debate about consciousness is organized. But then within that, we have experiences of things. I experience myself as me, as Anil Seth. I experience the world around me as objects with colors and shapes and moving and so on. And so there's another question now, which is, to what extent do the contents of my consciousness at any time reflect, in some sense, what's actually going on? And that's the wider question of perception, how the brain builds up some sort of representation, some model, some picture, although all of these things are slightly misleading, especially picture. It's not that there's some inner projector screen in our heads. But how does the brain create this experience of a world and a self from the sensory information that it gets? And here, to cut a long story very short, I think that the world that we experience is a kind of construction, but it's one that is tied very closely to real things happening in the world and in our bodies.
Yeah. So I heard you mention a couple things. One is like visual perception that we might have. You talked about, things we experience through our bodies and so on, which actually brings up really the theme of this show, which is about not consciousness in general, which, by the way, is a fascinating topic and could easily be a show by itself, but it's AI and consciousness. And obviously, LLMs today or AI today is not conscious by any of these definitions we're talking about.
Well, we don't know. I mean, there's debate about that, right? I mean, some people already, in fact, some experts in machine learning, not to mention other people outside the field, would say very differently. I mean, there's serious people who think that language models already, are not only able to carry on fluent conversations, but actually have consciousness.
Right. That's interesting. And by the way, I've heard even things like what you were saying, the table have consciousness. I've even heard like consciousness in a spectrum, proto-consciousness, and not a scientific perspective, but a philosophical perspective that all matter has consciousness. But I guess, coming back to what you're saying, maybe these language models have consciousness. The question in my mind is, what is that definition for AI to have consciousness? Like, if you were to bring it down to a checklist and say, I'm going to check a bunch of things and say, if it checks all of these or enough of these items in this list, I would consider this entity to be conscious. So what would be that checklist in your mind?
Oh, I wish I had one. I mean, that would be lovely. It would be lovely to have this checklist. In fact, that's I think it's really one of the most critical challenges that we have in this field of consciousness research very broadly, is coming up with what we might call tests for consciousness or checklists that apply not only to AI, but there are many cases where we're uncertain. I know we're going to focus on AI, but just to give some context, I mean, we also are uncertain about when human beings are conscious after severe brain injury. They might appear unconscious from the outside, but maybe they have conscious experiences that they can't communicate with. They can't use to communicate. What about non-human animals? We have a terrible historical track record of assuming, for our species' convenience, that non-human animals lack consciousness or lack a kind of consciousness that matters for ethical and moral purposes. We have all kinds of new technologies using synthetic biology that create little mini brains in labs. Many, many contexts, and it would be lovely to have a checklist. The problem is, frankly, we don't. So we have to operate in this zone of uncertainty, and just do the best that we can. Now, when we think about AI, part of the appeal, but part of the danger, is that things like language models might tick a lot of boxes that would be very meaningful if they were in other contexts, but might not be so meaningful in the specific context of AI. If a human being suffered major brain injury, but then was able to carry on a conversation with you in the same way that a language model can, we'd be very justified in saying, okay, that's sufficient evidence this person has regained consciousness. Because it's very, very hard to imagine a human being having a detailed conversation without being conscious. But the problem is it doesn't generalize. The problem is language models seem to be able to do these kinds of things in ways which might imply consciousness, but certainly need not. We don't know exactly how they work. In fact, it's hugely interesting how language models actually do what they do. But fundamentally, we know what they are doing that allows them to create the linguistic responses that they do. So it's very easy to get misled by taking humans too much as the benchmark for these kinds of checklists.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you've rejected my idea of creating a checklist, which is fair, right?
No, I think it's a great idea. I just don't think we're there yet.
We're there yet,
we
yeah.
can get there. I mean, that's the challenge. The more we understand about consciousness where we know it exists, then I think we can be much better informed about generalizing to these conditions of uncertainty. So it's definitely a tractable challenge, but it's not one we've solved yet.
Yeah. Well, I understand not having a checklist because it's a complicated problem. I, in fact, recollect reading some work by philosopher David Chalmers, who was talking about the easy problem of consciousness being things like you can explain behavior and things like that. But the hard problem of consciousness, if I understand correctly, is how do certain physical processes in the brain result in subjective experiences and conscious experiences.
Exactly. That was what I was saying earlier. Was like that's the core challenge of consciousness itself, independently of this thing about perception and reality. It's like, how does stuff in a very broad sense give rise to experience in a very broad sense?
Right. And I'm sure that's probably a big thrust of for research in this area, to try and understand this. But in the absence of a checklist, in the absence of even an understanding of how certain processes result in consciousness, how does one even go about answering this question of, is AI conscious, or will it be conscious? Like you said, table is not conscious. So there's some definition, or if not a definition, there's some way to at least say this is not, this is it. I can tell whether it is not, or it feels like it may or may not. But what is even that distinction?
Yeah, so that's a really good distinction. And I think there are a number of things we can do. So I don't want to be too pessimistic here and just sort of undermine every premise that you put on the table. Because we can say something. And the key, though, is in exactly the distinction that you just hinted at. On the one hand, we want to know what is the case. Is an AI system conscious? Is a newborn baby conscious, or whatever it might be, or is a mouse conscious, or whatever it might be? But then there's also the question of conscious seeming systems. So under what situations do we human beings assume that something is conscious, or feel that something is conscious, be unable to resist feeling that something is conscious? Because when we talk about the social implications of things like language models, there are two very different kinds of implications here, but they're both critical. As we become surrounded by systems that give us the impression of being conscious, whatever the fact of the matter, that can be very distorting to society. That poses a lot of societal challenges. if we have AI systems that actually are conscious, well, there's a whole other range of societal challenges that come about there that have to do with our moral obligations to them. Do they have welfare? Do they have rights? And so on. But we have to separate these two questions. They are distinct. And the way to do that is to kind of approach them separately. And on the one hand, ask ourselves, what are the factors that lead us, human beings, to attribute consciousness to things? What are our psychological biases? And then on the other hand, we also want to say, okay, how do we kind of adjust our credences about what really is the case? Is a language model really conscious? What would it take for it to be conscious? And that's where there's much less clarity, and there's a range of views. I have my own view, but to be honest, like all views, I think are relatively provisional about this. And the case of language models, I think, is pretty clear because they exercise our human biases in ways that other kinds of artificial system or even AI system don't. And it's always struck me that there's a lot of discussion about whether Claude is conscious or GPT is conscious, but you don't really hear people have the same discussions about whether AlphaFold is conscious, the AI system that does all the protein folding. But they're not that different. If you look at the code that runs on silicon chips that involves deep neural networks and other bells and whistles, the thing about language models is they're language models. They speak to us. And language we've always taken as this great signifier of things that we think of as distinctively human. And one thing we think of as being distinctively human and is being conscious. And we humans bundle all these things together, but just because they go together in us doesn't mean they go together in general. And I think that's a fascinating aspect of language models is they kind of pull apart language, at least in some form. It's arguable whether it's really language and so on, but they're impressive. They pull apart the kind of language they have from the question of consciousness.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting for me. And by the way, as I mentioned, even before this conversation, we started recording it, I'm no expert in this field, so this is an uninformed view. But for me personally, it has felt like seeing language models, I feel like, okay, it tells me language is not necessarily a very critical ingredient for me as part of that checklist, if one were to have that. I was thinking about information processing. You brought up AlphaFold. Now, again, I've kind of wondered about this question of how important is information processes and predictive modeling of the world around us? How important is that for consciousness? And I feel like maybe it's important, but it feels limiting to focus on that. And it can't just be that. But then I read this interesting perspective from Joska Back, and I'll read out something I read, which is that consciousness can arise from complex information processing. It involves self-modeling, narrative generation, and specifically that viewpoint, one of the viewpoints I read was consciousness is a narrative interface to model yourself and the world around you. And I wanted to get your reactions to that view because, again, AlphaFold has information processes, can do predictive modeling. LLMs can certainly construct a narrative. Whether they believe the narrative or not is unclear. Or do they have beliefs is itself unclear. But they can construct narratives. And so it comes to this point about, like you were saying, some people will call LLMs today as conscious entities. But how do you think of information processes and predictive modeling as a piece of an input to consciousness? And is it really the most important input, which I personally find hard to buy or digest?
Some good questions there. So yeah, Joscha Bach is someone I've talked to many times about this kind of topic. And we have, I think, very enjoyable disagreements about what's going on here. And they can take a couple of different forms. The piece that you read from him is, for me, it's a very interesting proposal about the nature of consciousness, that it involves this kind of of narrative self-modeling and so on. There are other theories of consciousness as well, and part of the job is to try and find evidence for these different theories, or rather to try and find evidence against them and see if they still stand up. And that's an ongoing challenge. But there's a deeper question, and the deeper question is critical to this question of AI and consciousness, and is also something where Joshua and I think, have different views about. And it's this question of information processing, as you say. So there's a view that's pretty common, that the brain is basically a kind of meat-based computer, and that what it does is adequately described in terms of processing information. It just happens to use carbon and neurons and exchange little spikes, little bursts of activity around, rather than being made of silicon and exchange ones and zeros as voltage transients around. But that's just implementation detail. The view is that really what matters is the algorithm, the computation, the information processing. And if you take that view and you think, okay, consciousness is something that the brain does. So if all that matters about what brains do is the computation, the information processing, then the fact that we're made of meat is slightly irrelevant. And if you can figure out the right algorithm, then you could run that algorithm on a computer made of silicon, a GPU rack, and you get consciousness. And there's a big gamble here, which is that all that matters for consciousness is this level of computation, of algorithm. And what's been interesting to me is how kind of deeply embedded this assumption is. And I think it's because it's a very powerful assumption. If you do treat the brain this way, and if you throw out all the details and just think of networks of neurons that exchange these signals, you get something very powerful. You get a very powerful description of a lot of things that brains do, and you also get this sort of formalism for developing AI that is also very powerful, as we see with the AI systems that are around us. And formally, we know that systems like this can do any computation. If we think about Alan Turing, he had a definition of computation, very general. Can do anything that a Turing computer can do. Turing machine can do. This is very nice, but it doesn't mean that it's the whole ball game, right? There may be other things that brains do that are important for consciousness that are not computations. And I think just recognizing that as a possibility is important. And if you look inside a brain, you find many things that challenge this sort of reduction of the brain to a meat-based computer. You don't have anything like this sharp separation of mindware and wetware as you have between hardware and software in a computer. To cut the long story very short, whereas the computers that we tend to have around us have a kind of independence from their material basis by design, by definition. You can run multiple programs on the same computer and you get what you want. You can run the same program on different computers. They do the same thing. I mean, that's great. That's what makes them useful. Brains aren't the kind of things where you can easily separate what they do from what they are. And if that's the case, then to me, it makes it much less evident that you could just strip away all the other stuff, take out this one level of description, the algorithm, and that would be sufficient for consciousness. I think that's almost certainly wrong. And if that's wrong, then conscious AI using the kinds of architectures that we have around us now is not on the table. It's not a question of finding the right algorithm. All you would do is have a very good simulation of a human brain or an animal brain being conscious. You wouldn't actually instantiate consciousness that way. And of course, this is not confusing in other domains. We use computers to simulate all kinds of things without expecting suddenly the computer to give rise to the phenomenon they're simulating. A simulation of a weather system doesn't get wet. A simulation of a black hole doesn't destroy the universe. But for brains, because we think they are not only usefully simulated by computers, but actually are computational at their most sort of important level, then I think we slip into this temptation and mistake the map for the territory.
Yeah, that's very well expressed. One quick clarification to our listeners. What I shared earlier was not a quote from Joschka Bach, but my notes after reading one of his essays, right? So I didn't want to misattribute, and he might express it very differently than I did, but at least it was a note based on reading his essays. And your point about the meat-based computer or that kind of perspective of consciousness, I find myself reacting quite strongly to your views in a positive way, meaning aligned with it, because I kind of feel like, one of the activities that moves me and reminds me of my conscious experience is watching a sunset. And so I'm in California these days, so a sunset at the Pacifica Beach near San Francisco, that's a moving experience. And yes, you can bring it down to light, refraction, light splitting into constituent colors, why these specific colors come in, and all of that. But none of those explanations for me could capture the conscious experience of being there. And so some of these, the meat-based computer view feels a bit reductive to me. In fact, one of our listeners shared an article with me recently where it started off talking about, the feeling or the experience of heat versus cold, and how we have over time created concepts such as temperature to capture that. But it feels like it's a simulation of the reality, like to use your analogy, versus the reality itself. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of wonder whether here again, the whole is much more than the sum of parts. And the meat-based computer is a big part of it. But you put all these pieces together, could you create the whole? And so I guess the question that I'll pose to you based on what I just said, beyond just your reaction to what I shared as my perspective on the experience being much different than these scientific concepts like temperature or refraction and things like that. But the question I would pose to you is, given where we are today, do you think we can build conscious AI at some point? And if so, would we build it, or would it just emerge from having done a bunch of other things and it somehow emerges?
I think, in a sense, that would be the most worrying prospect of all, right? Because it would be a sort of maybe unintended consequence, and introducing conscious systems into the world inadvertently would probably mean we have not thought hard enough about how we would deal with such a situation. But
right.
I'll come back to the likelihood of that in a second. I got a bit nostalgic. I used to live in California as well for my postdoc, and I remember many sunsets down in San Diego over the Pacific Ocean. I used to live right by the beach there, and it's not quite the same on the English Channel here in south of England, but nonetheless, the sunsets are still beautiful occasionally, just not every day.
And you have a different experience there. At least going by the London, my time in London, it's you enjoy rain and clouds, I guess.
I don't know. It's not so bad. Actually, it's not. I mean, this is very much a diversion, but I was very worried about how I would deal with the weather moving after 7 years in San Diego back to the UK.
Okay.
But to be honest, and to deflate a lot of stereotypes about the UK, the weather, especially on the southern coast, was much better than I remembered it. So anyway, that aside, sunsets, indeed, they're beautiful. And of course, it's difficult. Whether you think about the conscious experience of watching a sunset in terms of bits in a digital computer or stuff happening in a biological brain, in some sense, you face the same challenge. Like, the experience is not to be found inside a silicon chip. It just doesn't seem like the kind of thing that silicon chip could have. But also, what about a brain? It's a physical system too. The challenge is, okay, so if it's not the algorithm, the computational level of description, then what is it about the embodied, embedded biological brain that allows it to actually experience something rather than just be a kind of abstract model of a thing that experiences something? And that for me is the work of the next the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years. I mean, it's the same story, but I think it's slightly different now, because what I want to understand is what is special, or is there something special about biological systems that confers on them the capacity to have consciousness that non-biological systems do not have. And I don't want to resort here to, there's an old philosophy much derided now called vitalism, which just says there's something magic about life that sort of we don't need to explain further. It's just like life is magic and has magical properties. No, that's no good. What we want is a satisfying explanation of why life is important. That is natural, that is materialist, but that gives us some intuitive sense of how and why it works. And that's the kind of line of research that me and my group are pursuing. There are many clues here. There are things like living systems engage in metabolism. They create their own material basis. And the processes by which they do this, I think, can be directly connected to the processes by which the brain forms perceptual interpretations of the world and the body. So I think there are at least good reasons to take the possibility seriously, but it's still certainly not demonstrated. Now, that aside, the question of whether it's possible to build conscious AI, I think the answer to that is clearly yes, but it all depends on what you mean by AI. And I think if by it being possible, you just say, well, it's just going to emerge, come along for the ride as language models get smarter. Probably not GPT-5, but maybe GPT-100 or something. Maybe there'll come a point at which language models just get so smart that consciousness suddenly appears, the inner lights come on. I find very little to motivate this view. It sort of lies much more in our human exceptionalism and biases than in anything else. I think the real question is, how brain-like does AI have to be in order to move the needle on the likelihood of consciousness happening? If we did AI by recreating atom by atom biological brains, then sure, I think that would be clearly sufficient. That's just a kind of restatement of the fact that I don't think there's anything spooky or mysterious going on. So the question is, how far can you zoom out from that? At what level can you treat everything as implementation and not worry about it? And there, I think, who knows? But the interesting thing here is there is a lot of action in this middle. I mean, people are already talking about neuromorphic computing, forms of AI that are more brain-like than the racks of GPU servers that animate our language models. And the more brain-like you get, well, by definition, the more of what brains are and what brains do that you bring within the remit of AI. So that's my answer. Yes, it's possible. I don't think it's going to be possible with the kind of substrate-independent architectures that we have now, but technology is moving on from that for very good reason. I mean, for energy, brains are incredibly energy efficient, so independently of any other motivation, there's good reason to build more brain-like AI to make it much more energy efficient. And so these things will be happening.
Yeah, I think your mention of neuromorphic computing is interesting, and you talked about the biological basis and your lab's research on how biological processes like metabolism and others are central to, or likely important for consciousness to exist. That's pretty interesting, and it speaks to perhaps the possibility that eventually one could engineer it if one starts to build AI that mimics these kinds of processes. Is that
well, fair? I think it's fair, but I think we have to be very, it's kind of annoyingly pedantic, but we've got to be very careful about words like mimic. I don't think it's enough just to have a very detailed simulation of metabolism on a standard computer. Then all you've got is a very detailed simulation of metabolism. Nothing actually gets metabolized. So you fall into that same conflation of simulation of something with instantiation or realization of something.
Well, that's kind of what I've meant when I even said the whole seems to be more than the sum of parts, which is the sum of parts seems like a simulation to me. But I hear you. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, computer models can help us get to grips with that as well. I mean, there's a whole other territory there about emergence. You know, people use words like emergence again, I think, in somewhat slippery ways. That like, yeah, consciousness just emerges from our billions of neurons. But again, what does that mean when it doesn't mean magic? And one of the other things we do in our lab is we try to get much more specific about things like emergence to sort of quantify and characterize exactly what it means to say that something has the property that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, because it's probably relevant to consciousness. But I don't think it sort of just licenses the view that consciousness will just sort of pop into existence at some level of complexity.
Yeah. Let me shift gears a little bit here, Anil. We've talked a little bit about what is consciousness, and you brought up this interesting point that we certainly don't have a checklist for sure today or anything near it. We talked about engineering it or building it. I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about recognizing it when it does exist. So, for example, I have a dog. I can tell he has a conscious experience. He sees a truck, he experiences fear. I see that. But I cannot fully access his subjective experience. But I can access parts of it because I can certainly see he's getting scared of things and can see him getting excited when he sees us and so on. But now we go to an AI system. Suppose it passes every behavioral and cognitive test we can imagine of intelligence for the most part, but we cannot access its subjective experience. At what point do we treat it as conscious entity? And I ask this because, consciousness could exist on a spectrum. And so if it exists on a spectrum, what is the first sign that, hey, we have something that's likely conscious?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm afraid it raises another important distinction, though, which is intelligence and consciousness are not the same thing.
Right.
Just as language and consciousness are not the same thing. They go together in us, but I do think we make this similar mistake of human exceptionalism or anthropocentrism, seeing things through the human lens, if we think of consciousness just as a function of intelligence. And here's where AI is super interesting, because it may well tease these things apart. We might have systems that are truly intelligent, but they're able to be intelligent in ways that are entirely divorced from being conscious. And this poses a problem for when we attribute it, because the tendency is to take the sort of view that Alan Turing sort of got famous for, or more widely known for outside of his immediate circle, for things like the imitation game or the Turing test, which is basically a way of saying that if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. But he applied that specifically to the question of intelligence. And I think it's more defensible way of doing things when it comes to intelligence, because fundamentally intelligence is about doing things. Intelligence is about taking some input, transforming into some output. Something you hear, you say something. Some instructions you get, you do something. Intelligence is, again, hard to come up with a completely consensus definition, but it's basically about doing stuff in a particular way. But consciousness is not like that. Consciousness is not about doing, it's fundamentally about being, feeling. So inferring simply on the basis of walking like a duck, quacking like a duck, looking like a duck is a little bit more dangerous, because there's the possibility that some systems, like AI, can look like they're conscious, act like they're conscious, walk and talk like they're conscious without actually being conscious, because fundamentally it's a very different kind of thing. And that's why I think for consciousness, we can't rely on surface characteristics, behavioral characteristics, unless someone comes up with a really good class of things that says, look, in general, these things cannot be done without consciousness, whatever the system is. But as far as I know, no one's come up with a very good example of this. So we have to look inside the black box. We've got to look at, okay, what's actually going on that gives rise to these surface level characteristics, these behaviors, these functions. And then we have to interpret the underlying mechanism in light of our best theories about how consciousness happens. And that's how I think we can start to say sensible things. We have a range of theories, but maybe they agree on certain things. And if we see evidence for where they agree in the mechanism inside AI systems, then I think we have to shift our credences and say, okay, look, this is at least some evidence. It may not be 100%, but it shifts the needle from zero at least a little bit.
Yeah. This has been very interesting, and one of the takeaways for me is we are still in a early innings in terms of understanding consciousness, how it comes about, and things like that. So one of the last themes or questions for you that I have is, what is your research focused on these days? What are you trying to answer in your lab?
Yeah, we have a bit too much of a scattered lab, I think. One of my core interests really is this question of what philosophers call biological naturalism. So can we figure out experiments? Can we kind of really elaborate this idea and make it testable, and that consciousness is a property of living systems? Not necessarily just human beings, certainly not just human beings, but can we more directly connect properties of life with properties of consciousness? That's something I'm very excited. It's very challenging, but there are ways to do it, in collaboration with biochemists and biologists, but also computer scientists, because part of it's still recognizing how different brains are from the kinds of computers that we have around us. That's one thing. The other, I think, really important aspect of this debate I just wanted to mention is that we shouldn't be overly distracted by this question of whether AI really is conscious, because at the moment we can't know. So I don't think anybody should be trying to actively develop a conscious computer, because if you did, you'd have brought into the world things that have rights, that have potentially could suffer, and that would be ethically very problematic. But, and here's I think the key for the here and now, I also think it's dangerous to be developing AI technologies that give us the appearance of being conscious, that seduce our psychological biases, that if you like, role play at being conscious. And LLMs, language models, do this. I think this is very, very dangerous, because we project qualities like consciousness, feeling into things so readily. And if we feel that AI systems are conscious, then we start treating them in ways that are different. We start have arguments about whether they have rights or not, that will cause us to take our eye off the ball for other things that really deserve our moral consideration. We become more psychologically vulnerable if we think that something really understands us and is really feeling empathy for our problems and so on. So I think there are design implications here. We need to think very carefully about designing systems in ways that mitigate against giving the illusion of being conscious, because it can be a pretty dangerous illusion. So that's the AI stuff. I mean, in my lab, we do a ton of other things as well. I mean, we're very interested in this, the core idea of perception. I mean, consciousness is super interesting, but honestly, if that's all you spent your time on, I think it's a bit crazy making. So we try to do other stuff that's a bit more tractable in the short term. One is understanding how different people's perceptual experiences of reality are. We all seem to see things just as if we see the world as it really is, but we don't. It's a construction, and we all differ on the outside, so we all very likely differ on the inside too. So we're trying to understand the nature of these differences. And I think this has a lot of social implications too for building bridges between people by cultivating a bit of humility about our own take on how things are, whether that's the color of a lampshade or the political situation in the Middle East. So we study perception and its differences. We also do a lot of mathematical work trying to develop new quantitative measures of the brain. Now the brain is like it. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's the most complex object in the known universe, and we don't have the mathematical and theoretical tools that we need to try and make sense of this complexity. And I think that for me is a big challenge. And they all relate. The more clearly we can see what brains are by developing the right kinds of concepts and tools, then I think the less likely we are to be, I would say, overly influenced by the relatively appealing metaphors that we might have, that the brain is just a computer and we can forget about all the messy reality. So lots of things. The beauty of studying in this area is that it brings together many disciplines that have both this sort of existential interest, but also a real practical value in treating mental health as well. We do stuff with therapies for depression and so on, but they all revolve around this motivating mystery of how the brain creates the experience of a world and of a self.
Yeah, I think what you said just now, Anil, about the importance of understanding how the human brain works and the research around it, but also even some of the ethical and moral dilemmas surrounding creating sentient machines is, I think, the perfect food for thought for our listeners to mull over. So I will say this is a perfect point to end this episode. But thank you so much for joining us today on Creative Intelligence.
Thank you, Kartik. It's been a real pleasure.
Wow, that was one of the most mind-bending topics we could get into without involving time travel or mushrooms. I had a few interesting takeaways from that conversations. One of it is that while philosophers have been debating consciousness for a really long time, the science of consciousness is still in its very early days. And we, for example, don't have a checklist or a clear definition of what exactly constitutes consciousness and what does not. And that was a really interesting takeaway, because in its absence, it's very hard to say whether any form of intelligence is conscious or not. The other interesting point that Anil made was that reality is a subjective construction in our brain, and that was pretty interesting. It's almost like a controlled hallucination. And interestingly, for some of us who are business leaders, the takeaway is that what we are calling reality is sort of the best guess our brain can come up with. And so reality is very subjective, and there's my reality and there's your reality. And understanding that can also help us, I believe, become more empathetic individuals, empathetic leaders in the organization, and so on. So, lots to ponder over there. And of course, when it comes to artificial intelligence and consciousness, Anil brought up the moral and ethical dilemmas that we face if we could create conscious AI, and also if conscious AI can emerge even if we are not intentionally creating conscious AI. And so if consciousness can exist, then that conscious being will have some rights associated with it. And obviously then it poses questions for us in terms of what are our obligations associated with that. So lots to tackle there. I'm sure as AI systems become more and more intelligent, we will start bringing up and facing this question more and more, and we'll have to really debate, what our responsibilities are, what our safeguards should be around sentient machines. For now, of course, it remains a sci-fi topic, but one that we should certainly be thinking about as AI systems are becoming more intelligent. Anyway, that was another episode of Creative Intelligence. I'm your host, Kartik Hosanagar. Thanks as always for joining, and I very much appreciate any comments and suggestions you share. So please do engage with the topic of today's show, either by sharing your comments on this platform or on social media. Until next time, I'm your host, Kartik Hosanagar. Stay curious.